Hello, and welcome to the launch of the International Energy Agency's new Net Zero Roadmap, the 2023 update to our landmark report. I'm Jethro Mullen, head of the IEA's communications team, and I'm joined today by IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, by our Director of Sustainability Technology and Outlooks, Laura Kotzi, and by our Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Timur Gül. So they're going to tell you more about what's new in this Net Zero Roadmap, which I would like to note is free to read, explore, and download on our website. During today's press webinar, Dr. Birol will make some opening remarks, then Ms. Kotzi and Dr. Gül will present the key findings of the report. We'll then have time to take some questions from journalists. For the journalists taking part in this press webinar, we invite you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll also take a 2-minute break right after the presentation for you to submit your questions. With that, I'll hand over to our Executive Director, Dr. Birol.
Many thanks, Jethro. Greetings to all from the International Energy Agency headquarters. Dear colleagues, dear friends, many of you know that 2 years ago, exactly May 2021, we made our Net Zero 2050 report, and in a very short period of time, it became a benchmark study for governments, financial institutions, companies, citizens, civil society, and we are very happy with that. Many of you know we publish a lot of reports at the IEA to provide insights for the decision makers, for the citizens. But that report we published in May 2021 was one of the most successful ones. Lots of thousands of people downloaded it. We were very happy with the result, and also with the platform it provided for a good debate for the people who are sincerely interested to reach our climate goals. Now, after that report, more than 2 years passed, and in that last 2 years, many things have happened, including a global energy crisis. So we thought to update our report. What changed in the last 2 years or so? Are we in a better place or in a worse place? Our hopes are less or more to reach our 1.5 degrees target, which is dictated to us by the nature, dictated to us by the scientists who are telling us that this is the only way that we can have a life in the future more or less similar to what we have today. So, of course, in the last 2 years, many things happened. First, some rather worrying things. When we look at what the scientists tell us, that the 2023, this may well be the hottest year ever recorded. The global climate continues to change in a frightening speed. We have seen wildfires, we have seen droughts and floods, extreme weather events around the world, and not only scientists, people in the street around the world, not only in the advanced economies, in the emerging countries, in Asia, Africa, are aware that the climate change is a big trouble. So this is one worrying trend that we are seeing. The climate change is coming, and at the same time, another worrying trend is when we look at the carbon dioxide emissions, they remain stubbornly high. Especially the last year, 2022, we have seen emissions still being very high. But we have a big but, because when we look at the numbers at the IEA, we have numbers very carefully, as we do always. We see that there are legitimate reasons to be hopeful. Mainly, we are seeing that a new clean energy economy is emerging around the world, and this emergence of clean energy driven by key energy, clean energy technologies, we see that the path to 1.5 degrees target is narrowing on one hand, but the clean energy technologies, the spectacular increase in the clean energy is keeping the door still open. So this is definitely something we are very happy to see, and we are hopeful. In fact, we see the impact of clean energy day to day on the global energy picture. Leave aside our net zero scenario, what needs to be done. Our analysis show that even there is no new climate policies are put in place by the governments. We think they will put new policies in place to save our planet. It's an urgent situation. Even no new policies is introduced. We see that with the current policies, 3 fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, may well peak before 2030 within this decade. So we think this is a very important development as a result of the very strong, spectacular increase of the clean energy technologies and the changes in the economic structure of key consuming countries. So what needs to be done to reach our 1.5 degrees target? My colleagues Laura Cozy and Timur Gül will go to the details of those and what are our milestones. But I wanted to tell you that if we want to reduce emissions from fossil fuels, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels. So simple. And our numbers show that if we want to reach the 1.5 degrees target, fossil fuels, their use need to decline close to 25% between now and 2030. Dear colleagues, some colleagues do say that it is difficult. And what we say that it is not difficult. It is very, very difficult. It is a Herculean task. We are well aware of that. We are aware of that perhaps more than many people are aware because we look at the numbers. But this is not dictated by the IEA. This is dictated by the nature, and this is dictated by the situation that our planet is in. If we want to reach the 1.5, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels. But if we really don't have a sincere interest to reach our climate targets, so this is another story altogether. Now, coming back to our, or at least my remarks in the beginning, why I am hopeful. When I compare where we were 2 years ago, when we published the first Net Zero 2050 study, and today, I am really more hopeful. Because of the numbers, I can tell you that at least two major clean energy technologies are going very strongly. One of them is solar energy. As IE has said recently, solar became the king of electricity markets. The old king, coal, is over, and now solar is the new king, not only for climate reasons, mainly because it is cheap. The cost is coming down. Big growth of solar and other renewables, wind and others. The second growth comes from the transportation sector. Electric cars. 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, 1 out of 25 cars sold in the world was electric. So 1 out of 25 2 years ago. And this year, according to our numbers, it is 1 out of 5 cars sold is electric. And it is growing in all key markets. So the growth coming from solar, electric cars, other energy technologies are very, very impressive. And we think they play an extremely important role to bring the need for fossil fuels in the next years to come. Another aggregate indicator, and for me it is very impressive. In the last 2 years, since we made the original net zero report, global clean energy investments in 2 years increased by 40%. And they reach today global clean energy investments to 1.8 trillion US dollars against an investment for fossil fuels 1 trillion US dollars. So today the entire budget, energy investments for all the energy sources, 2.8 trillion US dollars, 1.8 for clean energy, and 1 trillion for fossil fuels. And the increase in the last 2 years of 40% of clean energy investment is very impressive, driven by the Inflation Reduction Act from United States, from Europe, from China, and India, and elsewhere. Very impressive. But again, to reach the net zero 2050, 1.8 trillion US dollar clean energy investment needs to reach to 4.5 trillion by 2030. So today 1.8 and needs to be 4.5 trillion in 2030 if we want to reach our net zero goals globally. So this is a tall order. Once again, we know this is a Herculean task, but again, this is not dictated by the IEA. IEA is a translator of what is dictated by nature and by the scientists around the world. So, dear colleagues, I would like to finish my remarks with one challenge I see, a big challenge in front of us. So there are many, many challenges, numerous challenges on the technology, on the economic side, on the political side. But if I have to pick up out of these thousands of challenges, which is critical, for me it is the following. It is the geopolitical fragmentation among the countries around the world. This is rather worrying. We are at a time, in terms of the climate crisis, where we need to bring all the countries together because climate change does affect all the countries, all the citizens of all the governments. But I see that unfortunately at this very time, geopolitical tensions among the countries are rather serious. And it is the reason my appeal to the governments that as climate change does not isolate any country, any continent, any geography, we should be able to isolate geopolitical questions among the countries and try to have an international collaboration for the common challenge of the humanity. Our report provides a route for the world to reach net zero. And of course, each country will have its own route to reach net zero targets. But, dear colleagues, there is no route to net zero globally without having a fair and equitable international collaboration among the countries in this world. So I thank you very much for joining us today. I would now like to pass the floor my colleagues, Lara Kozi and Timur Gül, but also I wanted to thank them and their teams and all the colleagues in the IEA, because it's a huge work undertaking to bring millions of numbers and analysis together. All the peer reviewers around the world, peer reviewing our report, who not only spent a lot of time, efforts, but also who put their hearts in this very important work. With this, I would like to now turn to our director, Lara Kozi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. It's my pleasure to now take you through some of the key findings of our new updated analysis. Maybe let me start by reiterating some principles of design of this report that are exactly the same as the one we did 2 years ago. Dr. Birol mentioned them already. First of all, what we are doing here and trying to do with this report is translating what reaching the global climate targets of 1.5 degrees means for the energy sector. We are doing so with a global pathway. Is one pathway. Every country will have their own specific pathways dictated by their own circumstances, but we are very much taking into consideration equity considerations. We have had the pleasure to accompany a number of countries over the past 2 years in their own, doing their own net zero roadmaps, and what we have seen is very clearly that if a country has an energy access problem, that energy access problems will have to be solved in the route to reaching net zero. So this is what we are doing in our global roadmap. Every country in the world that has an access problem will reach their full access in the route to net zero. And always in the spirit of equity, advanced economies will take the lead in accelerating further and fastest their energy transition, getting to net zero earlier to leave space to emerging countries and developing economies. What we have been doing over the past several months that we've been working on this update, our large team, which I thank in this opportunity as well, is to go through really thousands of data, policies on technologies, on investment trends, on country by country trends. And what we find is, first of all, not a good news. What we have been comparing is our milestones in the 2021 report. We are seeing over the past 2 years very high level of CO2 emissions, clearly not on track to the type of decline, peak and decline that we need to see to be on track with 1.5. We have been seeing investments in, for example, coal-fired power plants and other fossil fuels. Also this not on track with our original milestones in the net zero roadmap. However, is not all bad news. We are seeing tremendous growth in few key clean energy technologies. Here what you're seeing on the chart now is the growth in electric car sales and solar PV capacity additions. What you see there is simply spectacular growth, but what matters the most is that the growth rate that we have been witnessing, and we are witnessing as we speak now, on those two key clean energy technologies is exactly in line with what we were expecting and hoping to see 2 years ago when we did the milestones. So this type of acceleration that we are witnessing, really picking up over the past 2 years, is leading for the first time us to say that even without any additional climate policies, this decade we will see a peak in demand for fossil fuels. This for emission translates in something critical to reach net zero by 2050, 1.5, which is seeing a peak in emissions by 2025 and then see decline in emissions. So We are nearly there with the first part of the statement, so we are going to be seeing a peak in emission by 2025, but we need a much faster acceleration afterwards in the decline in emission to 2030. Now, our updated analysis shows how to reach that, especially in the critical decade to 2030. And what you see here, I think, is a very important finding. This finding tells us that we have and we know all the technologies that are needed to cut and slash emissions to be on track with 1.5, to bring back on track the world to 1.5 this decade. You see there is renewables, is efficiency, is electrification, is things that we know how to do. So this is not about inventing something new, it's about making sure that everyone uses and accelerates the deployment of those technologies. So going into more detail, what do we need to do? We need to decarbonize the electricity sector. How do we do it? First and foremost with renewables. So it doesn't come here as a surprise. We have seen the spectacular growth of solar. We will need to triple from now to 2030 renewable installed capacity to really decarbonize very fast our electricity sector. The good news in terms of feasibility is if you look at plans for advanced economies and for China, we are 85% there or where we will need to be. So it's about expanding this big renewables growth to other countries. Of course, countries may use other technologies than renewables. We are seeing at least 30 countries in our net zero report that are relying on nuclear, for example, and this clearly means that they can use this technology to decarbonize. Now, the next fundamental pillar is doubling the rate of energy intensity. What does that mean? So this is one of the cases in which every country will reach this milestone in a different way. If you are a country in sub-Saharan Africa where you have a large part of your population not having access to clean cooking, then the first priority will be switching away from biomass, which is very inefficient, which is polluting, to more modern forms, be it LPG, be it electricity. And this is the way the country will achieve this critical target. If you are a middle-income country, most likely your fastest growing part of the energy demand is in air conditioning. So what you will need to do to achieve this target is actually making sure that your air conditioners are as efficient as possible. And if you are in advanced economies, then you need to push ahead with electrification. So here it would be selling electric vehicles that are around 20% of sales this year to nearly 65%. Again, in terms of feasibility, we are seeing some of the larger markets without additional policies already looking at around 60% of these shares. The last pillar that we are really seeing needed for 2030 is methane emissions reduction from fossil fuel operations. I will not go into detail here. We have been releasing parts of these critical parts of these reports and analysis over the past several months, and we'll have a major installment just before COP. But I want to say just a word about the importance of methane emission reductions. With CO2 abatement alone, it's very likely that we will go above the 1.5 degree target. So what we need to do is really to put a lid on the increase in temperature, and this we can only do with very potent greenhouse gases such as methane. So if we were not able to do so, basically reaching the same 1.5 targets would mean not achieving globally net zero by 2050, but even earlier. So we would really need to push ahead on abating methane to leave more space for the world to continue on their CO2 abatement route. So how do we achieve these challenging goals to 2030? The key things we need is money. Dr. Birol mentioned it at the beginning. Today, we are counting $1.8 trillion going into clean energy investments, vis-a-vis $1 trillion for fossil fuel. Over the past 2 years since we released the report, this number has grown 40%. How much does this number need to go to 2030? We said it earlier, it's 4.5 trillion. In aggregate terms, this means that the effort that the world managed to do over the past 2 years, this 40% increase, if it is continued to 2030, we would reach this amount of money. Very clearly, the critical important part here is making sure that this clean energy transition is spread also to emerging countries and developing economies. And here there is a role both for advanced economies and multilateral developing banks to contribute to these efforts. So if we manage to achieve this acceleration, this continued acceleration in clean energy investments, what we would see is that basically the world energy needs will be fulfilled by clean energy. This means implications for millions of new clean energy jobs. It means implications, good implications for industrial growth. It means implications, good implications for clean air in cities. At the same time, with the right policies, for example, eliminating gradually fossil fuel subsidies, this would lead to a decline in fossil fuel use and therefore a decline in emissions fully compatible with limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So if this decline in demand occurs in this way, then we would reiterate the very important milestones that we said and findings that we said back in 2021, that we would not need any new unabated coal-fired power plants, nor investments in new oil and natural gas. And I will turn the floor now to Dr. Gül on manufacturing and other parts of the analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Kotzi and Dr. Birol. I'd like to take it from here by explaining a bit why we are still optimistic about the clean energy transition. Policy has been mentioned as a key driver. Energy trends have been mentioned as a key driver, but another one is the clean energy industry, where clean technology manufacturing today is a huge industrial opportunity that many countries are starting to take advantage of. We already have significant capacity to manufacture key technologies in operation today. For solar PV and wind, their output is equivalent to around one third of the production we need by 2030. For heat pumps, it is around 1/4. Solar PV manufacturing capacity in particular is not fully utilized today. Manufacturers are currently operating on average, at a global average, well below the levels that could be considered typical for this type of industry, because investments were made in anticipation of higher demand. If operated at a typical level, then today's capacity would already be sufficient to supply 2/3 of the solar PV deployment that is needed by 2030 in our pathway. And there is more to come. That's the important part. That's the important message from the clean energy industry. We are collecting industry announcements from around the world, and if we assume that all the manufacturing projects that have been announced around the world proceed on time and in full, then global manufacturing capacities for solar PV and electric vehicle batteries would essentially be sufficient for what we need by 2030, even in this updated new net zero by 2050 scenario. We place higher expectations on these particular two technologies. This is significant. It is significant because solar PV and electric vehicles alone provide around 1/3 of the emission cuts that we need to achieve by the year 2030 in our scenario relative to today. Of course, not all of these projects will go ahead. Many of them have not yet reached a final investment decision, and the announced manufacturing capacity for other technologies is still quite far from the levels that we need to achieve by 2030. Wind industry supply chains in particular are struggling, with announced manufacturing projects falling way short of what is required. It is an area where policy support is clearly needed, but we have seen in the past that manufacturing can be ramped up very quickly. The lead times to build such projects are very short, 1 to 3 years on average, so policy can have a very, very quick impact here. Another important reason to be optimistic on clean energy transitions is progress on technology innovation. When we released our net zero by 2050 scenario 2 years ago, we showed that almost half of the CO2 emission reductions by 2050 need to come from technologies that were not yet in the market at the time we made the analysis. This is not about some technology miracle at all. This is about the fact that some important technologies, like certain battery types, were still at demonstration or prototype stage. At the IEA, we track the readiness of more than 550 clean energy technologies every year, which allows us to reflect very, very closely on technology progress. And the good news coming from that work is that in our assessment, in the updated net zero by 2050 scenario that we're releasing today, the share of emission reductions in 2050 and coming from technologies that are under development today decreased from what was almost half in our last report to 35% this year. Two important underlying drivers here. First, there has been considerable progress on clean energy innovation, including through the commercialization of several technologies such as sodium-ion batteries. They are a key example. They were prototype stage 2 years ago, and they are now making their first market entry. The second reason is that the market for clean energy technologies is changing very, very quickly, and so we have updated our analysis with recent investment trends as well as announcements from technology manufacturer and other stakeholders. A key example here is the use of hydrogen in heavy-duty vehicles. In this year's analysis, it's lower in terms of the expectation than 2 years ago, given the pace at which new electric models are being announced by manufacturers and given the changes that we have seen around battery chemistries. But there's much more that needs to be done, of course. Innovation is an area that needs policy support to get on track with net zero by 2050. Many technologies that are at demonstration stage today show encouraging results, but they need targeted support to get into the market and to scale quickly. Now, the clean energy transition is not only about massively scaling clean energy technologies, clean energy investment, or accelerating innovation. It is also about how to manage the transition, how to manage it in terms of the emerging new risks, how to manage it in terms of addressing potential key bottlenecks, and to manage it in terms of ensuring that the benefits of the transition can be as widely shared as possible. Going through these points one by one, the demand for critical minerals is one key area where security risks absolutely need to be managed. Total demand for such minerals more than triples in our scenario relative to today, but there is a looming supply gap despite capital spending for the development of critical minerals increasing last year and exploration spending increasing as well. Announced mining projects are not yet fully sufficient for the needs of the net zero scenario, and there has also been limited progress in diversifying supplies. To address these risks, the IEA is actually hosting a summit this week on critical minerals with ministers and decision makers from all around the world. In terms of bottlenecks, achieving net zero by 2050 will require large, new and smarter infrastructure networks. Transmission and distribution grids are a key example here. They need to expand by around 2 million kilometers per year to 2030 in our scenario. This is a challenge because such large grid projects today can take more than a decade, especially in countries where permitting times are long. Other energy infrastructure projects, such as for hydrogen, face very similar challenges. We will need a build big mentality here. We need to speed up decision making. We need to think strategic about repurposing existing infrastructure wherever this is possible. For the case of electricity grids, the IEA will release a special report on grids actually next month. Finally, but just as important, the point of affordability. This is affordability, energy affordability needs to be safeguarded through the transition. The outcome can obviously be a positive one. By 2030, total energy expenditures of households in emerging markets and developing economies decrease by 12% in our scenario compared to today. But tapping into these benefits for consumers comes at an upfront cost. Cleaner and more efficient technologies typically come at higher upfront costs, and so policymakers will need to support households, particularly those with low income, to manage the transition. In the concluding slide, I would like to come back to points that have been made by our Executive Director and Ms. Kotzi earlier. Our net zero scenario offers one pathway to what is a common goal of reaching 1.5 degrees, but it's of course not the only one. Different countries will need to chart their own routes depending on their own circumstances, their own capacities, which our scenario takes into account, of course. Nonetheless, despite these regional differences, there are some key milestones that are important for policymakers all around the world, wherever they're sitting. First, governments are rightly focused on energy security today, but new long lead time upstream projects will not solve the immediate concerns, but risk locking in emissions that could push the world over the 1.5 degrees threshold, and they could become a commercial risk as the transition proceeds. Second, this year, 2023, is the year of the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, and so we set out several key ambitions in the report for policymakers around the world to focus on a failure to increase ambition to 2030 along the lines that we have set out in the report would make meeting the 1.5 degrees goal extremely challenging and much more expensive, requiring the massive deployment of carbon removal technologies that have today not been proven at scale yet. We must therefore do everything we can to bring emissions down today. The Paris Agreement also requires countries to submit new nationally determined contributions, NDCs, in 2025 for the period to 2035. And so the report highlights key milestones for that particular year for each sector and for each technology. But there are also key milestones for governments. By 2035, to be on track with net zero globally in 2050, our analysis shows that advanced economies need to have reduced emissions by 80% and emerging markets and developing economies by 60% in aggregate relative to today. The goal for 2050 is very clear: net zero emissions for the energy sector by 2050, a huge transformation from where we are today, with electricity generation reaching 90% from renewables in our pathway, wind and solar alone supplying 70%, nuclear capacity doubling from today in the countries that are pursuing this option, building on recent policy support. The energy system in 2050 in such a pathway is much more electrified than it is today, with electricity supplying more than half of total energy consumption, and we need to be able to take carbon out of the atmosphere, both to reduce remaining emissions and supply a carbon feedstock for synthetic aviation fuels in particular. This is a huge challenge. This degree of change is a huge challenge, as the Executive Director highlighted in the beginning. We are keenly aware of that, but it's also a huge opportunity for the countries, the industries, and all other stakeholders who wish to support it, and we stand ready to help in this endeavor. With that, thank you very much, and back to you, Jethro.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So we now have time to take some questions from journalists, and we invite the journalists in attendance to send your questions through the Q&A function of the Zoom, if you haven't done so already. And please do mention your media outlet along with your question, and media outlet and name, just to make sure we know who the questions are coming from. We'll take a 2-minute break to give you a chance to enter your questions. We'll be right back. Hi everyone, welcome back. So we have a lot of questions. We're going to get through as many of them as we can in the time we have. We have quite a few questions on the messaging on fossil fuel investment and the findings there. So we're going to try and take as many of those as we can in one go. So Philip Roos from Energy Intel asks, can you comment on the change of wording from no new oil and gas resources to no new long lead time oil and gas resources? And Terje Erikstad from the Norwegian Business Daily asks, could you elaborate what you mean by long lead time for gas and oil fields? There's also a question from Claudia Antunes from Sumama in Brazil, saying that Brazil, because of its low carbon intensity, intends to keep oil production even in 2050, and even increase it. How does this fit into the global picture? So I think, and also just, I think Ronan Kavanagh asking about the fact that the previous report was not received well by some oil and gas producers. Did we expect that reaction, and why do we think it was so strong? Anyway, there's already a lot of questions, so I'll let Dr. Birol address this fossil fuel investment questions as he sees fit. Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Jethro. There are so many questions around the same topic. And first of all, I will try to say a few words, but I would very much like to suggest to colleagues to have a good look at our report. There is a good discussion on the investment in fossil fuels. And I should also say that before the COP28 this year, which is going to take place in a major oil-producing region, we are coming up with a special report on the oil and gas industry in clean energy transition. We are making some analysis and some recommendations to those countries so that they are not caught unprepared from the clean energy transition, and at the same time they are part of our fight against climate change as part of the energy industry. Now, first of all, I should say, our position in terms of there is no need for investment for the new coal, oil, and gas is not changed. But I want to make it one thing clear. Once again, this is subject to big push of clean energy, as such reducing the fossil fuel demand, because we need it to bring it down to reach our 1.5 degrees target. And if we are successful to push the clean energy and replace the fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel declines in line with what we have foreseen, then you don't need new oil and gas fields or coal mines. But this doesn't mean that as of tomorrow, we don't need any investment for oil and gas. We will still need investment for oil and gas, because we will use oil and gas even in our scenario, 1.5 degrees scenario, net zero 2050 scenario, because they are the part of the energy mix, but in a declining manner. We will still use them, but much less than we use now, in order to avoid the catastrophic climate change. So therefore, there is a need to put money, investment in the existing fields, oil fields, gas fields, to keep the production at a certain level that it can meet the declining oil and gas demand, so that we have an orderly transition from fossil fuel dominated energy world today to a cleaner energy system, where we will still have some oil and gas in the future. So this is our, in one word, our analysis. But I want to, if I may, say one more thing. And this is important also for the oil and gas producers. As one of the journalists asked, how the oil and gas producers will react to this, I don't know. I hope they will read it carefully, because there are some important heads up for those companies. Now, even if there are no new climate clean energy policies imposed, set by the governments, with the current existing policies and current technology and market trends, we see that the oil, gas and coal use globally will peak before 2030 and start to decline slowly but surely. Therefore, even in the absence of new policies, oil and gas companies need to think very carefully, because those large-scale fossil fuel investments not only do pose a risk for our climate, but also, given the new demand trend I tried to explain, they also pose a business economic risk. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. So the next question we have is about China. And it comes from Subel Rai Bandari from Radio Free Asia. China is the world's top emitter and also a leader in renewables. So it's, you know, has a key role on both the fossil fuel side and on the clean energy side. And so, what is your message to China in this situation, given the high use of fossil fuels? And perhaps we can combine that with a question, the message to China, and also a question on COP28. Many government, business and civil society leaders are traveling to Dubai in December for COP28. What is your advice or your message to them based on this report? So messages for China and messages for leaders globally.
So many tough questions, Jethro, and interrelated issues. Now, China is, based on our analysis, China is today number one in terms of solar, number one in terms of wind, electric cars, additional new nuclear capacity, hydropower in all clean energy sources, and in terms of clean energy investments, also China is a leader. But at the same time, coal, the fuel which is the most carbon content, is still having a dominant position role in the Chinese energy mix. When we look at the global picture, we see that there is no room. There is no room for unabated new coal plants if we want to stick to our 1.5 degrees target. For the COP28, I think I would, there are many suggestions that my colleague Mrs. Kozi share with all of us what needs to be done in the energy sector, and these are the, we hope, these our recommendations will be forming some policy goals agreed by all the countries, doubling the energy efficiency, tripling renewable capacity, the 75% decrease in methane emissions, and decline in fossil fuels, starting with coal and the others, are formally adopted as a global goal in Dubai. But one thing I want to perhaps say is that the international cooperation among the countries, this is key, and this is, in my view, the Achilles heel of our fight against climate change. This is the message that I would like to share.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. So the next question, a couple of questions we'll try to get to. So we have a question on what has changed between the 2021 roadmap that we first published and then this 2023 update. So what are the key changes? And in particular, Perrine Moutarde from Le Monde in France asks if there's a way to compare the goals in fossil fuel demand and emission reductions by 2030 with the goals that were stated in the 2021 net zero roadmap. And then also a question from the Associated Press, I'm just looking for that because there are a lot of questions. It came from Sibi Arasu from the Associated Press in India. Given a lot of requirements to meet 1.5 degrees goal is still not in action, such as financing that is needed or ambitious clean energy targets, could you comment on the probability of global warming thresholds being breached soon, as it was briefly earlier this year? So I think Laura Cozzi is going to take these questions. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Jethro. So maybe in 2 minutes, what has changed since 2021? Basically, a lot of the milestones you will see are very similar. But in summary, what we are seeing is that there are 2 sectors in the world, one the power sector and the other the car passenger segment, that have actually taken off in terms of decarbonization with solar PV and with electric vehicles. We haven't seen this type of takeoff of decarbonization coming to other parts of the economy, in particular the industry sector, in particular buildings and so on. So we, compared to a couple of years ago, we are still clearly seeing an advancement in the progress of decarbonization for a couple of sectors and parts of the world. Advanced economies, China, are pushing ahead. What we are seeing lagging behind is certain technologies, CCS, for example, and decarbonization of certain parts of other parts of the economy and other parts of the world. So the acceleration to 2030 that we mentioned earlier, we really need to bring on board all countries, making it widespread and going beyond the two sectors that are really moving fast now. In terms of the 1.5 threshold, absolutely true. This year, we are on average, as temperature increase compared to pre-industrial level at 1.2 degrees. What we are trying to do with this scenario, I'll say something a bit technical, is having a pathway that limits temperature increase to 1.5, similar to what the no low overshoot scenarios the IPCC is having. We are doing something I think also important, which is the following. We are asking ourselves the question, what if countries around the world go into this COP and don't raise ambition to 2030? Could we still make it to go back to 1.5? And what we find is actually that we would breach the 1.5 degree goal within the next decade, stay above 1.5 for many decades, and the only hope that we would have to go back to 1.5 is to starting removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think that from now to December, the world has a very simple question to answer is, do we want to accelerate on technologies and policies that are in our hands today and raise ambition to 2030, or do we want to wait decades and hope that we can have deployment at scale of carbon removal technologies to keep 1.5 within reach? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And so the next questions concern CCUS and hydrogen and some of the other emerging technologies. So one question we have there from, and I'm just looking for the question, from Henry Edwards Evans from S&P Global Commodity Insights. He asks, does the growth in solar, EVs and electrification generally offset the slow development in CCUS and clean hydrogen? And then Susanna Rogers from Carbon Pulse asks whether the IEA's view on the role of carbon capture and storage has changed since the roadmap was first set out 2 years ago. So I think those are the main questions that maybe Timur, our Chief Energy Technology Officer, could take. Over to you, Timur.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jethro. These are excellent questions. Now, I think we've tried to highlight in our presentation at multiple occasions, and also Ms. Kotze in her intervention just now, we have seen stunning progress for solar PV electric vehicles in the last couple of years, and it allowed us somewhat to rebalance technology expectations to 2030. What we did for this particular report is we did a comprehensive review through all the progress that has been made, all the project announcements that have been made. But ultimately, there is no such a thing like offsetting. You can't offset one technology for the other because, of course, solar PV, electric cars will help, as Ms. Kotze mentioned, will help us to decarbonize power generation as well as the passenger transport and other transport areas. But it will not help us with all sectors of the energy industry. When it comes to CCS, we will need all technologies. We have not changed our view that it's an important technology for reaching climate goals, but what we have done is we have scaled back expectations. And this is really, there is great momentum. We are seeing this. We are observing this big project pipeline that is coming, new business models that are emerging. We do need CCS, certainly in particular applications such as cement and others. But momentum is really clearly not enough. It is time for this technology to deliver at scale, so we have scaled back our expectations to 2030 in particular for CCS, and we hope that this is a warning call for the industry to make CCS happen moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Timur. I think we've covered the lion's share of the questions. I don't think we're going to be able to answer every single one of them, so we will come back to those of you whose questions we didn't get to in due course via email. But one last question that we can squeeze in, are the high energy prices we're seeing today the result of climate policies and clean energy? And I think Dr. Birol will maybe take this one.
Okay, thank you, Jethro. Yes, today we have oil prices higher than 90, even flirting with $100. As such, putting a lot of pressure on the economies, especially those in the emerging countries who import oil, and puts inflationary pressures on the economies. But this has nothing to do with the clean energy policies. This is a deliberate oil production policies of the oil producers led by two top oil producing countries. And I think it would be unfair to relate this $100 oil price to clean energy and clean energy policies. But I can tell you that this $100 oil price will further accelerate the clean energy transitions as it will give a boost to clean energy technologies from an economic perspective as well, such as the further expansion of electric cars. So since this is the last question, Jethro, may I also once again thank our director, Lara Kozzi, for directing this study with a huge team, and also our Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Timur Gül, for their great efforts with their big teams to make this study happen. And we hope that it provides a basis for a good discussion for the people who really want to fight with us against climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol. That is all we have time for. We've already gone quite a bit over time to squeeze in as many questions as we can. If any journalists have questions that didn't get answered during the Q&A that you'd like to follow up on, do reach out to us at the press office. We'll also do our best to come back to you on the questions that we've seen. So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Birol, to Ms. Kotze, and to Dr. Gül. Thank you to the journalists for the great questions, and thank you to everyone for following this event online and for your interest in our work. A reminder that the full 2023 update of our Net Zero Roadmap is available for free on our website, iea.org, so do please take a look. And a key area of clean energy transitions, as my colleagues have been explaining, is supplies of critical minerals to make those clean energy technologies. And we'd like to invite you to join us to follow the opening session of our Critical Minerals and Clean Energy Summit, which is taking place on Thursday. The opening session will be live streamed, the same places you're seeing this event, 10:30 Thursday morning, Central European Summer Time. We hope you can join us then. That's all for today. Thank you and goodbye.